This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the March edition of The Compliance Life. This month I'm featuring Audrey Harris. Audrey is a managing director at Affiliated Monitors. Audrey has one of the most interesting careers in compliance, having begun just after the turn of the century in private practice investigating FCPA cases, working as a chief compliance officer at an international company, going back into private practice, and now taking all of that knowledge to Affiliated Monitors to help companies build out compliance programs. In part one, academic career and early professional life.
The Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a chief compliance officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll be right back with Audrey Harris on The Compliance Life. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of The Compliance Life. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me Audrey Harris. Audrey is a managing director at Affiliated Monitors, but she has one of the most interesting and unique journeys, both to the CCO chair and beyond. So, Audrey, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Excited to be here. Talking about compliance, I could, quite frankly, nerd out about it for quite some time.
So, Audrey, could you tell us, maybe start with your academic and early professional career? Where'd you go to college and law school, and what were you interested in at that point?
Well, I would say in my early career that goals will get you where you think you want to go, but then you should probably never say never. Kind of the theme of my early academic career. I actually wanted to be a lawyer in the 3rd grade. So by the time I got to Georgetown Law, I knew I wanted to be a prosecutor. I actually was a research assistant for Sam Dash. I spent my 3rd year doing Georgetown Criminal Justice Clinic, which, by the way, I would recommend for anyone. And I really thought, hey, I'm going to be a prosecutor. Then I entered Kirkland Ellis, and things started to change just a little bit.
Where did you go, or you said you wanted to be a prosecutor? Did you start out as a prosecutor, or did you start in a different direction?
Well, actually, as I said, when I headed to Kirkland Ellis, things changed just a little bit. I decided to do my summer associateship at Kirkland Ellis, and I again said, I'm only going in now for 3 years. I'm going to pay off those student loans, and I'm never going to do this partnership track thing. And that changed when I was a summer associate. And I was sitting in my summer associate office, I think probably at maybe my first week there really. And an associate came into my office and said, hey, Audrey, you want to go to South Beach and do an interview? Obviously, I said yes, and got on an airplane the next morning with a white-collar team and did interviews of Latin American executives on an FCPA case. So that was my welcome to the world of FCPA. So this was a little bit of a different time period. People were questioning whether FCPA was the same things as TCA, Federal Tort Claims Act. Compliance functions were few and far between. There was legal and there was audit, but not really that professionalization of compliance. But in this, at Kirkland Ellis, I found this mentor in Larry Ergensen, who was the head of white collar and had used to have been the head of the fraud section, which had FCPA jurisdiction. So in this moment, as a summer associate, I just dove into FCPA, and as a first year associate, diving into being able to do things that I don't think the first years would normally be doing, but it was the beauty of having a mentor who just let me run at that point in time. So as I was doing that, I had some of the really coolest cases you can imagine during that time period, even pre 2004, and had this great mentor in Larry who just let me run, let me investigate, let me learn about all of these cases. And I started to learn compliance really firsthand. So I had to go into these companies and look at what happened, why something happened, and how we can really prevent it from happening in the future, to really even as a price of admission of resolving with DOJ back then and currently. So I was on the ground, and I'd often meet individuals in these companies, and often it would be like one person who I would meet who would help me understand that company, understand what was going on in the company. And from there, I really learned that there were always signs of these bigger investigations, these issues that were happening way before the investigation, way before the incident. And there was really this personal price that these individuals in the company, including it was usually like an administrative assistant or someone who was helping me, that would pay. They wouldn't get bonuses that year. There was a personal price to the culture that had allowed this to happen within the companies. So this really gave me this love and interest in compliance at this point in my career, which I was really surprised by. And it kept me there at Kirkland past those 3 years and straight through partnership.
You're one of the few people who really did white collar defense in private practice before going into the CCO chair, but it seems to me you learned some pretty useful skills and tools in your white collar practice. And I wanted to ask you a couple of those. The seeing of chaos and finding patterns in that chaos. How did you, and then learn how to ask the question why, and not why once, but maybe why 3 or 5 times. How did you learn those? And then how did you maybe use those a little bit later?
Absolutely. So there's 3 things that I really learned that I love to do while I was in the white collar defense chair. And that was really problem solving. As you said, looking at chaos and finding the patterns, finding the buckets, finding the way to simplify it down to really what those root causes were. And also asking that question and being curious about the why. And this became really important for me when I ended up taking the CCO role, as you mentioned. And that's actually something that I said I would never, ever take, by the way. When I said never say never as a theme of my career, it definitely is. I had seen a lot of CCOs die what I'll say are painful professional deaths. And I had seen CCOs either be Dr. No or really be what I'll call business capture. Being that agile CCO in the middle was a really hard thing to do. And I had really only seen very few folks do that well. So originally, I would say I was learning all of these skills, but I was questioning whether or not I would ever use them in the CCO chair. That was for sure.
One of the things that intrigued me about your story is you came into this field really when it was, I don't want to say completely nascent, but certainly much smaller. And back then, I think the only qualifications were to be able to spell FCPA. But there weren't a lot of professional compliance officers, and many of us came into that role having been either a general counsel. I came from the contract side of a corporation, but I'm a recovering trial lawyer. And so many of us had to learn compliance on the fly. Did your experience in private practice give you a little bit better grounding on not simply what a violation was, but really how to detect and prevent it, which are 2 of the 3 prongs of a best practice compliance program?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a external counsel, I'd seen, as I said, lots of different companies and really crawled through the belly of those companies to figure out how their business models work and how the compliance controls can actually prevent those, what went wrong and how to prevent it going forward in lots of different business models, because as you know, compliance programs have to be designed around how a company goes to business in order to be effective. So having had that kind of knowledge, that benchmark, in a time where we didn't really use the word benchmark, I think really helped in going into what I found to be one of the toughest jobs in a company, but also one of the most really impactful that you can have in that CCO chair.
We've used the word chaos a couple of times, but I really wanted to use patterns. Did you begin to see patterns of how misconduct would start and then how it would manifest really from company to company, or did each investigation really literally stand on its own feet?
I will say they're patterns. There were always patterns, as I kind of alluded to before. There was always something in some indicators, and they might not be in the FCPA realm. They might not even be in the financial controls realm, but there were indications within the culture. Maybe it was bullying conduct of the individuals that were involved. Maybe it was loose controls on everything from petty cash to to how they hired, to nepotism hires and things that were going on. I had one case in particular where I'll say the behavior of one of the individuals involved included things not only bullying, but things like painting over two different parking spaces in the parking lot for his car there. These indications that the culture was one dominated by a specific personality and didn't have those checks, didn't have people had raised different issues and even small issues, and they have been somewhat disregarded. So one of my kind of individual goals in compliance was to look at how can we actually go and see these and detect these smaller, say the leading indicators or emerging risks that are coming up in a company and prevent that big risk from really manifesting. So those patterns that I would continue to see, they would be different based on business model and things like that, but they were always there. And so looking to those other indicators that are there, including behavior and culture, other financial controls, could really bring us to some of the root causes and then how to change them going forward.
So as we move through the first decade of this century up to 2010, we literally saw an explosion in the both number of FCPA enforcement actions and in the overall fines and penalties. What was that like for you really as external counsel? Was not simply more work, but was there finally a greater awareness of what not just the FCPA was, but what compliance was as well?
Absolutely. It would be actually what I'll call an FCPA explosion, but also a compliance awareness that was coming through. And at the same time, I think companies were changing and seeing reputational risk and social license to operate risk, which really became very important to me as a CCO, really becoming a pull. So there was a push from the regulators that was happening at the time, but there was also slowly building an awareness and a pull on the commercial side and on the governance side for compliance in these spaces. So it was actually an excellent time to be part of such an expanding practice and some of those great cases from the early 2000s right up through 2010 and all the developments that we're seeing at that time with the first guidance being released with an SEC unit being created just for FCPA. When I started, there was one person doing FCPA in the fraud section, Peter Clark. There are many more. I think they're up to 40 plus FTE count around FCPA in the fraud section today. So really you're seeing an evolution in a very short time period, considering the statute was passed in 77. But so being there and on the ground, it was a great time to be an associate. It's a great time to be a young partner because you're learning compliance from firsthand. You're working with companies through all of this, and you're experiencing some of the first things, some of the other firsts, like the first FCPA consultant in a resolution, the first self-reporting requirement in a resolution. And those things are really fundamental to and kind of accepted to what the FCPA is today. And those were new and groundbreaking during that time period.
Let me change the focus just a little bit to the commercial response, because I grew up in the energy industry, practiced in Houston, and at one point, Houston, Texas was the FCPA epicenter of the world. because more Houston-based companies had been involved in FCPA enforcement actions than any other city. And that, of course, was because of the ubiquity of energy companies. But what that led to was, after the fines and penalties were paid, was a commercial response. And that commercial response was essentially the following. There are 3 large production companies, Exxon, Chevron, and Shell. Then there are 4 service companies that did the work for those. And if you wanted to work for any of those service companies, literally down to a $15 million software company that had one piece of software that did something, you had to have a compliance program in place. And so the businesses drove compliance down through the supply chain. Now, part of that was because I saw that because energy was so concentrated in Houston. But did you begin to see that type of commercial response in other industries where it was not simply, we're going to have a compliance program in place, but if you want to do business with us, you have to have a compliance program in place?
Absolutely. And that commercial pull that you're talking about, that commercial case for compliance, is one of the things that even opened me up to a CCO role. Because I saw that trend developing, and I think we see that trend may have started in the energy industries, and particularly in large U.S. who are looking into their supply chain and making that pull. Those considerations are part of tender. They're part of supply chain audits that were happening. But you see that franchise and move and expand into global companies, and you see the subject matters starting to expand, not just FCPA, but the larger anti-corruption, trade sanctions compliance, now human rights compliance, ESG compliance. We started to see these really expand. So what you saw in that epicenter of Houston, and I know we were both probably on what we used to call the FCPA Express back and forth between DC and Houston. What may have started there really started a trend to that commercial case for compliance, which really led me in part to the CCO role, and doing something I never said I would do.
Well, Audrey, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode where we take a look at you moving into something that you said you would never do, which is the CCO chair. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you will join me again next week where I take up another episode in The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.